Here's a number that should stop you cold: 50 million. That's how many Toyota Corollas had been sold globally by the year 2021. 50 million units of a single nameplate across 12 generations. Not combined sales of a brand. One car. To put that in perspective, the Volkswagen Beetle, which many of us thought was simply unstoppable, sold just over 21 million units across its entire 65-year production life. The Corolla passed that milestone nearly 25 years ago and never looked back. But here's what's really interesting. None of that was inevitable. In 1966, if you'd walked into a boardroom at Ford in Dagenham or sat in on a planning meeting at Vauxhall in Luton, nobody was losing much sleep over a small Japanese car company and its new economy sedan. Toyota had already tried the American market in 1958 with the Toyopet Crown and had retreated in embarrassment. The car was overpriced, underpowered, and completely wrong for roads that could handle real speed. The memory of that failure was still fresh. So what happened? What changed between that humiliating 1958 episode and the point just over a decade later, when Toyota became the second largest selling import brand in the United States, trailing only Volkswagen? The answer to that question is a small, unpretentious, brilliantly engineered car launched in Japan in the autumn of 1966. A car that cost 432,000 yen at its Tokyo area showroom price. A car that a former aircraft designer built using a philosophy borrowed from the quality control teachings of an American statistician. A car that would eventually prove the old maxim: the most dangerous competitor is the one nobody takes seriously until it's too late. Welcome to the story of the first-generation Toyota Corolla, the E10 series, and how a car from a country still rebuilding from the ruins of World War II quietly changed the direction of the entire global automobile industry. Section 1. Japan. In 1966, a country in a hurry. To understand why the Corolla was built the way it was, you have to understand Japan in 1966. This was not the industrial giant we know today. This was a nation that had emerged from total devastation only 21 years earlier and was now in the grip of what economists would later call the Japanese economic miracle. Prime Minister Hayato Ikeda had launched his income doubling plan in 1960, a bold government program aimed at doubling national income within a decade. It worked. By the mid-1960s, Japan's economy was expanding at a rate that stunned Western observers. French President Charles de Gaulle reportedly dismissed Ikeda as a transistor salesman, a remark that aged rather badly, all things considered. In 1956, Japan's entire automobile industry produced roughly 110,000 cars. By 1966, that figure had risen to approximately 2.3 million. Think about that for a moment. A 20-fold increase in 10 years. And the people driving those cars were different from the buyers of the 1950s. They weren't simply grateful to own any car at all. They were increasingly prosperous, increasingly sophisticated, and increasingly demanding. The opening of the Meishin Expressway in 1965 and the planned completion of all routes of the Tokyo-Nagoya Expressway by 1969 meant that Japanese drivers were for the first time facing genuine highway speeds. A small, gutless economy box would no longer do. People wanted something they could be proud of, something that felt, in the words of Chief Engineer Tatsuo Hasegawa, somewhat luxurious, even if it was priced for the masses. New car sales in Japan stood at 2 million in 1966. They would double to 4 million by 1970. The Corolla, it turned out, was not just meeting a wave of demand, it was, in part, creating one. Section 2. The The man who designed aircraft and then built the perfect family, Ka Tatsuo Hasegawa, was born in 1916 and had spent World War II designing aircraft. After the war, he turned his engineering mind to automobiles at Toyota, and his fingerprints are on some of the most interesting cars the company produced in the post-war period, including the elegant Toyota Sports 800 and the earlier Toyota Publica. He would go on to become a senior managing director of Toyota Motor Corporation. But his masterpiece was the Corolla. Hasegawa began conceptualizing what would become the Corolla in the latter half of 1962, drawing lessons from the Publica, a car that had failed not for mechanical reasons but for human ones. The Publica had been priced at 360,000 yen in 1961, which was only about 14 times the average monthly Japanese wage of that era. Admirable economy, in theory, but buyers stayed away. They didn't want the cheapest possible car. They wanted a car they could feel good about owning. That experience became the foundation of Hasegawa's approach to the Corolla. He articulated a design philosophy that Toyota's internal documentation later called the 80 points plus concept. In every measurable area of the car's performance, comfort, quietness, safety, economy, maintenance ease, durability, the Corolla was required to score no less than 80 out of 100 against customer expectations. Not 90, not perfection. 80 consistently across the board, no weak spots, no area in which a competitor could find an easy advantage. And crucially, Hasegawa wrote in the design plan policy for the Corolla. In the future, Corolla will compete both in Japan and overseas with European-made cars in the same class. Superiority of the Corolla over the competition will be ensured through performance and economic efficiency. He wasn't boasting. He was setting a target in writing from the very beginning. Section 3. Building the new Takaoka plant. Betting the company. Getting approval for the Corolla project was not straightforward. Toyota's management was experiencing rapid growth and was deeply cautious about the costs of new vehicle development. Each new model required equipment investments of tens of billions of yen. Failures were not merely embarrassing, they could be catastrophic. Approval was initially granted only for the development of a new engine. But Hasegawa had bigger ambitions. Eventually, Toyota committed to building an entirely new manufacturing facility, the Takaoka plant, at a cost of 30 billion yen. That was the level of financial commitment required to bring the Corolla to life. The new plant used the quality control methods that American statistician W. Edwards Deming had introduced to Japanese industry in the early 1960s. Toyota had formally enlisted Deming's process improvement system in 1961, and by 1965, the effects were already visible in the Toyota Corolla. The Corolla was the first Toyota designed and built entirely within those disciplines from the ground up. The result was a level of build consistency that would take European manufacturers years to understand and even longer to match. Section 4, the engine, the tax bracket, and the 100 cubic centimeters advantage. The original plan called for an engine displacing under 1,000 cubic centimeters, the threshold for a favorable road tax bracket in Japan. But during the development process, Hasegawa made a decision that was simultaneously commercially risky and strategically brilliant. He increased the displacement. The reason? A competitor? Nissan had launched the Sunny, known in some markets as the Datsun 1000, just months before the Corolla was due to arrive. If Toyota was going to compete, it needed an edge, and so the new K-series engine was revised late in the design process to displace 1,077 cubic centimeters. Yes, that bumped the Corolla into a higher Japanese tax class, but it also gave Toyota an advertising campaign that any good copywriter would have relished: the 100 cubic centimeters advantage. The K-series engine was a water-cooled inline-4 with an overhead valve configuration. Hasegawa's team had initially considered an overhead camshaft layout, which would have been technically more advanced, but the engineers lacked sufficient experience with it at the time, and development schedules were already tight. The OHV layout was refined carefully, with the camshaft positioned as high as possible within the cylinder block to sharpen valve timing response. The result was 60 horsepower from 1.1 litres, genuinely competitive for its class in 1966. A Toyota press release issued on October 20, 1966, made a claim that raised eyebrows at the time. The Corolla offered acceleration exceeding that of European cars in the same vehicle class. That was a bold thing to say in 1966, when European compacts from Ford, Fiat and Renault still dominated the thinking of most buyers outside Japan. As it turned out, it was not an idle boast. Section 5. What was under the skin? Engineering that mattered. The technical specification of the first-generation Corolla reveals a car that was carefully calculated rather than brilliantly innovative. There were no radical departures from convention, but almost every conventional solution was executed better than the competition. The wheelbase measured 90 inches, with an overall length of 3,845 millimeters, a width of 1,485 millimeters, and a height of 1,380 millimeters. Compact by any measure, but the tall roofline and smart packaging gave the interior a sense of space that surprised first-time occupants. Rear seat room in particular was described in period road tests as genuinely generous for a car of this size. The transmission was a 4-speed manual with floor-mounted shift, which caused some internal consternation at Toyota. In Japan in 1966, floor-mounted gear shifts were associated with trucks and rough-duty vehicles. A 4-speed gearbox, meanwhile, was widely interpreted as a sign that the engine lacked the torque to manage with 3 ratios, which was entirely backwards as logic goes, but was genuinely the perception of the day. Hasegawa overrode the objections. Buyers responded with enthusiasm, and the floor shift became a standard of the industry within years. The front suspension was perhaps the most technically significant element of the whole car. Hasegawa insisted on McPherson's strut geometry, at the time a first for any Japanese passenger vehicle. The system had been developed by Earl McPherson at Ford Motor Company around 1950 and had first appeared on a mass-produced car built by Ford UK for the European market. It offered a better ride than conventional leaf springs, was lighter, and took up far less space under the bonnet, which meant more room for passengers. Hasegawa even visited Ford Japan to study the relevant engineering materials, and Ford cooperated fully, apparently with no awareness of what it was actually helping to create. The difficulty of achieving a working McPherson setup was considerable. Early prototype vehicles could travel just 500 meters before the suspension failed. Engineers and Hasegawa persisted through 2.5 years of iterative testing before the system was ready for production. It was worth every frustrating day. That suspension configuration is now standard on the vast majority of passenger cars sold worldwide. The rear suspension used a live axle with leaf springs, conventional, simple, inexpensive, and entirely appropriate for the car's intended use. The choice reflected Hasegawa's 80 points plus philosophy. No unnecessary sophistication, no cost where it wouldn't pay dividends in customer satisfaction. Standard equipment on the Corolla included features that were genuinely noteworthy for the era and price: reversing lights, electric screen washers, cabin carpets, hazard warning lights, a detachable rear-view mirror, and partially reinforced windscreen glass. Many of these items were optional extras or simply absent on European competitors at equivalent price points. The dashboard used non-reflective materials, and instruments were round dials rather than the horizontal radio-style gauges then common. It was a small thing, but it felt purposeful and driver-focused. Section 6. The launch, November 1966. The Corolla went on sale through Toyota's network of Corolla stores in November 1966, initially only as a two-door sedan. The standard model in the Tokyo area carried that price of 432,000 yen. By May 1967, a four-door sedan had been added, along with a three-door light van variant and a Toyota Glide two-speed automatic transmission option. Domestic competition was fierce. The Nissan Sunny had arrived just months earlier. The Subaru 1000 was already in the market, but from the outset, the Corolla sold with a confidence that those rivals could not quite match. AG Toyoda himself later acknowledged that it had not been automatic, that it took real work to build the public demand that eventually made the Corolla a phenomenon in Japan. New car sales in Japan totaled 2 million units in 1966. The combined effect of the Corolla and the Sunny rivalry in driving aspirational demand among Japanese buyers was remarkable. 4 years later, the Japanese new car market had doubled to 4 million units annually. Section 7. Going global: Australia, America, and the world. The Corolla's first export market was Australia from November 1966. Australian buyers received right-hand drive versions identical in most respects to the domestic Japanese models. The reception was positive enough to encourage Toyota to push further. The critical move came in 1968 when the Corolla arrived in the United States. The asking price was $1,700, roughly equivalent to $15,500 at today's values. Toyota had done the preparatory groundwork well. The Toyota Corolla, introduced to the US in 1965 as a re-engineered replacement for the failed Toyopet, had already begun repairing Toyota's American reputation. The Corolla built decisively on that foundation. The numbers tell the story plainly. Toyota sold approximately 40,000 cars in the United States in 1966. By 1970, that figure had risen to 208,000. In 1968, just 2 years into the Corolla's American life, it had climbed to second place in US import sales, behind the Volkswagen Beetle, but ahead of everything else. By 1971, Toyota was selling more than 300,000 units annually in America. The first victims, as one automotive journalist of the era observed, were not the American manufacturers, not initially. They were the low-cost European imports. Fiat, Renault, Simca, NSU, brands that had found comfortable niches selling affordable European motoring to American buyers who wanted something different from Detroit. The Corolla was more reliable, better equipped, and just as characterful. One by one, those European brands retreated or collapsed entirely. By 1990, even Volkswagen was under serious pressure in North America, quietly considering whether the US market was worth maintaining at all. Toyota's European expansion was more deliberate and more cautious. The company's strategy was to enter markets first where there was no strong domestic automobile manufacturing tradition. Greece and Switzerland in 1965, Belgium in 1966. Only gradually did Toyota move into the home territories of the major European manufacturers, France, Germany, Italy. The Corolla and the Toyota Corolla arrived in Europe with equipment levels that genuinely surprised local buyers. Reversing lights, electric screen washers, carpets, standard equipment on a Toyota that was optional or absent on European competitors at similar prices. And behind all of that equipment was the thing the Europeans found hardest to match, the build quality and reliability that the deeming manufacturing discipline had made possible. Section 8. The one weakness: rust. It would be dishonest to present the first-generation Corolla as a car without faults. There was one significant and well-documented weakness, and if you were among those who owned or worked on these cars in period, you already know exactly what it was: rust. The early Corollas, and this was true of most Japanese cars of the era, and indeed of most European and American competitors, were vulnerable to body corrosion at a rate that could be startling in damp climates. The body steel of the late 1960s and early 1970s was not treated with the anti-corrosion processes that would become standard practice from the 1980s onwards. British and Northern European buyers in particular found that a well-maintained Corolla could develop serious rust issues within 5 or 6 years of ownership, regardless of how conscientious the owner was. This was not unique to Toyota. The Volkswagen Beetles and British Leyland products of the same period suffered similarly or worse, but it meant that relatively few first-generation Corollas survive today in unrestored condition. A genuinely original E10 Corolla in solid running order is now a rare and collectible item. It is also, it should be said, one of the most honest windows available into what 1960s affordable motoring was actually like. The rust problem would be addressed progressively through the 1970s and 1980s as galvanized steel and improved primer technology became standard across the industry. Toyota, characteristically, addressed it systematically rather than reactively. Section 9. The legacy: what 50 million cars actually means. The first-generation E10 Corolla ran in production from November 1966 until April 1970, a production life of 3.5 years, after which it was replaced by the second-generation E20. Toyota had already committed to a pattern of facelifting each Corolla generation at the 2-year mark and replacing it entirely at 4 years, a discipline the company maintained with remarkable consistency through subsequent decades. In 1997, the Corolla passed the Volkswagen Beetle's cumulative sales record to become the best-selling automobile nameplate in history. It has held that title every year since. By 2021, 50 million Corollas had been sold. That milestone involved 12 separate generations, production in 13 countries, and sales in over 150 markets worldwide. None of that trajectory was anything like inevitable in 1966. It was the result of one aircraft engineer's insistence that an affordable car for ordinary people deserved real engineering, real quality, and a specification that gave buyers something to be genuinely proud of. Tatsuo Hasegawa's 80 points plus philosophy, the deliberate rejection of any weak spots, the refusal to cut corners where corners actually mattered, turned out to be exactly the right approach for a world that was finally, in 1966, beginning to have choices. The European automakers who didn't lose sleep over the first Corolla learned to lose it over the second and the third and every one that followed. If you bought a new small car in Britain or America in 1968 or 1969, or if you worked in a showroom or a workshop or on a production line making European or American cars, you were watching something happen in front of you that many people in the industry were not yet willing to name. A Japanese car company building a modest, unpretentious, sensibly priced family sedan was demonstrating in real time that reliability, quality of construction, and thoughtful specification could beat glamour and tradition every single time. The 1966 Toyota Corolla did not win by being dramatic. It won by being honest. It offered buyers what they actually needed, delivered it without fuss, and kept working long after some of the more romantic alternatives had started falling apart. The McPherson strut front suspension that Hasegawa's engineers perfected over 2.5 years of patient prototype testing is still found in refined form on the front axles of the overwhelming majority of passenger cars sold today. The floor-mounted 4-speed gearbox that Toyota's own management considered a liability became the universal standard within a decade. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Corolla story is how many people inside the automotive establishment of 1966 failed to see it coming. Not because the evidence wasn't there, but because it seemed so unlikely that the threat would come from this direction, from a country still rebuilding, from a company that had embarrassed itself in America only 8 years earlier. Those of you who were there, who drove these cars, worked on them, sold them, or competed against them, you understand in a way that no history book can quite capture what it felt like to watch that shift happen. I'd genuinely like to hear your recollections. Did you own an early Corolla? Did you work for a dealership that sold them, or one that was selling something against them? Whatever your experience, share it in the comments below. These are the details that written history gets wrong or leaves out entirely. If you found this video worthwhile, please do click the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who care about real automotive history. And if you want more of this kind of in-depth storytelling about the cars that shaped the world we drive in today, subscribe and make sure you have notifications turned on. There is a great deal more to come. Thank you sincerely for spending this time with a story that deserves to be told properly. You're exactly the kind of audience that makes it worth telling.